Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with George Gascón?
Yeah, this is George.
Hello, how are you? This is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. I'm really so delighted you could take our call and be part of this program.
Hey, Paul. So good talking to you, and thank you so much for the invite.
Well, you're very welcome. Tell me briefly, if you could, how have you been living these last 6 months of this quarantine?
Yeah, it's been mixed. On the one hand, I'm spending a lot more time with my spouse than I ever had before. On the other hand, it's really taken a social toil personally, and I think with the other parts of my family. We have a family that tends to be very touchy, and we now have to limit that. So when I get to see my kids, often we're giving ourselves a simulated hug because, they sometimes through work have to be exposed to other people. My mother is very ill, and we mostly get to see her through a glass now. We can actually be right there with her. Many of my friends, many other people that I know, people that I love and respect, we now get to see virtually, which I guess on the one hand is wonderful that at least we're seeing each other electronically, but there is a lack of human connection there that it certainly impacted me personally, and I know it has impacted many others.
And I'm so sorry about your mother. The terrible aspect of that is that probably more than ever she needs to be in contact with you.
Yes. Yeah, it's like I said, it's a very, very set of conflicting emotions. I mean, very recently, in fact, I was just thinking about this issue. I have 4 grandkids, and they range in age 1 year old to the older one's 5, and I had 2 girls that are 3 years old. And I was walking with one of my 3-year-old. We were. And she's one that has been quarantined quite a bit. So we were actually holding hands and walking together, and we're, talking to a 3-year-old, right? So the world through the eyes of a 3-year-old, and all of a sudden, completely unexpectedly, she blurts out, and she calls me abuelo, and she says, "Abuelo, I don't like coronavirus." And, this little voice, and it's, a little gibberish in the way she talks, and also going to have to stop again. And I asked her, I said, "Audrey, what did you say?" And she says, "Well, I don't like coronavirus." And then, it took me a moment to think about it. And I asked her, "Well, why not, Audrey?" And she says, "Well, I don't get to play with my friends the way I used to." And I thought that was so profound, because here's a 3-year-old, 6 months is a big, big portion of her life at this point.
Yeah.
And for her to have such a profound impact on her, it was so telling about, what we're all going through. And often we think sometimes, kids may not be as impacted as we are. And so it's heartbreaking, to say the least. And then,
without going into, the details of all of that, it will be very interesting. I think you and I will still be around in 10 or 15 or 20 years, we hope. And to see the impact this moment will have had on the 3-year-old, on the 10-year-old, on the 15-year-old who doesn't get to go to school. It's different, I think, George, for you and for me. But for them, these extraordinarily formative years are tremendously important. And as you know, even in your line of work and duty, you know what it means to criminalize a 15-year-old boy. The brain is not formed.
Correct. You're absolutely right, Paul. And that is precisely the worry and the concern. And, I'm very fortunate actually that my kids are very sophisticated. In fact, the mother of this one girl, she's a very bright attorney. In fact, a lot brighter than I am. My other daughter is an educator by trade. So, at least I have the fortune of being, having a family that understands the complexities that you're raising, Paul, and tries to mitigate that impact. You can only imagine, kids that are less fortunate, that, parents are unable to try to even partially fill that vacuum because of economic reasons or other circumstances. How difficult this is.
Yeah. George, in a TED talk you once said about the war on drugs, it is unconscionable, it is immoral, it is unethical. Can you say a little bit more about that? Your words here seem to be so very deliberate.
Yes, and what I was trying to convey, and I try to do that as often as I have an opportunity, is that when you think about the war on drugs, and I use the term war on drugs because I know it paints a very clear picture for most of us. I personally think more as a war on poor people and people of color, to be honest with you, certainly in the U.S. experience. But I understand that, as a communicator, sometimes you want to make sure that you are as clear as you can to those that you're communicating to. So the war on drug, I think it paints a very clear picture for most of us. But what I was trying to say is that we have taken in this country and in many other parts of the world, but the U.S. has really led the charge in this. And taking what should have been addressed as a social issue, as a public health issue, and we turn it into a criminal justice problem. And then we went about applying the tradition of institutional racism that has plagued this country since the beginning of time. And we sort of put racism on a turbocharge, if you will, by sort of channeling this problem into the criminal justice system and creating criminal justice answers to these problems and criminalizing entire communities, incarcerating people, and at the same time building up the economic incentives to continue to do this and grow more and more and more. So we created the concept of private prisons. We enlarged the size of our police departments, of our public prisons and jails. We pour billions and trillions of public dollars to support and create this machine, fed into a tremendous amount of political power behind it, and destroy generations of our communities. And I think, that was such an immoral response that was partly driven by the history of systemic racism in this country, partly driven by the opportunities for monetizing that response. And I think that is just incredibly immoral, and that's what I was really referring to.
Could you take us back to a younger George and give us a sense of your personal evolution on issues of policing and punishment? You have said about your early career as a police officer, I was a warrior. I viewed myself as a police officer on the thin blue line, that I had to make as many arrests as I could. I think that George of then perhaps has changed a bit.
Yeah, I would say probably more than a bit, Paul. But it's interesting because, my own personal evolution, I'm going to even take it a little further back first and then get you there, because I think it contextually will provide further insight. So, I grew up in a family of political dissidents. My family immigrated from Cuba. They were anti-Batista, which was a very authoritarian regime before the Cuban Communist Revolution, and then they supported the revolution. And then when the revolution became what they realized wasn't a democracy, then they became also dissidents again for the second time. And so I grew up in a family that there was always political turmoil and disagreement with government. And then as a young immigrant, I struggled with my own demons, being a monolingual Spanish speaker, dropping out of school, and eventually, obviously, coming around to all that. And really almost as an afterthought going through college with the intention of becoming a history teacher, shifting gears because of a friend had joined the LAPD, and then I became an LAPD officer. I went through the ranks. I was successful, went all the way to being the number 2 running operations, which is probably the second largest job in the LAPD. All the police stations, all the detectives, aviation come under that command, other than the chief of police, who obviously she or he has the entire organization under their care. But in actually coming from a place of political dissidency and distrust of government, and then arriving here and feeling that, my family certainly felt that we had arrived to the promised land. And we did in many ways. There's certainly opportunities that we've had here that we could not have in our native Cuba. But understanding and still having at heart the fear of the unbridled use of governmental power can be. And then growing up in the police department, actually believing that we were the guardians, if you will, of our society, and what we were doing was necessary to protect our community. And then evolving and getting to the point as I saw the fruits of my own work, and actually I would say sometimes the poison of my own work, and how we were destroying communities, how we were going from one generation to the other, trying to apply solutions to a problem that was mostly created by our own doing, and just simply by applying the wrong tools to social and economic and public health breakdowns. And so I went from that place of believing that what I was doing was actually on the right side of the angels, if you will, to understanding that there were not only limitations to the utility of what I was doing, but then understanding that actually so much of what I was doing was part of a larger social and economic problem in this nation that preceded certainly me, and really beginning to start looking for other ways of addressing those issues and becoming more and more distant from that part of the thin blue line that you mentioned, Paul.
I want to stay a moment with your education, because in college you studied, I was so interested in reading this, George, you studied ancient history, Greek history, Roman history. How will the perspective history affords, do you think, inform your work as district attorney? What I was particularly interested in, George, was that you were interested not in the grand, great moments necessarily, but in the moments of transition.
Yes. And there's no question that I believe, and I believe the history, as human beings, I think that having a thorough understanding of sort of where we came from and who we are, and learning from the mistakes of the past, I think they are critically important to the development of the future journey. And certainly in looking at ancient history, I think that there's so many lessons, right? I mean, whether you're looking at, classical Greek history, classical Roman, and, how nations and how empires are built, what are the failures and the excesses, and what are the consequences of that. And to a great extent, I think that unfortunately history tends to repeat itself. And, I know that a lot of people would probably, that would be listening to us, will say, well, I think you're being a little melodramatic. There's a tremendous difference between who we are today and, what happened in classical Greece or Rome, or for that matter, the UK there, but I don't think so. I think that there's a certain energy that sometimes develops the creation of something, and then that energy sometimes, maybe good or bad, but has an impact on the formation of things to come. And if we're not careful, we can continue and we can go into some very, very damaging directions. And so to me, when I look at the work that certainly my lifetime work, which has been, community safety and public safety, I think is tremendously important. And I become more and more convinced of that. Understanding the history of our own nation, right? Understanding sort of the beginning of this country, understanding the beginning of public safety in this country, the legal profession, policing. And I think when you go beyond the sort of the idealistic look of the system, and you start, sort of getting behind the curtain and ripping some of the ugliness, it's hard to walk away without a thorough understanding that much of what we do today was really embedded in the development of a slavery and, economy and a nation that was really built on slaving other human beings. I mean, reinforcing the belief that one class was superior to another, one group of people was superior to another, because that's the only way you can justify enslaving people, right? You have to believe somehow you're morally superior. And then, we have a civil war, right, which is supposed to kind of end that, but then how, the resiliency of that foundation becomes extremely creative. And then we use the criminal justice system in another way to make sure that we take the people that we had enslaved before back to slavery through very legalistic ways of accomplishing that. And then, that continues and that gets us to the war on drugs. And that goes to that point that I've made concerning the immorality of it. I have to tell you something, Paul, and I think this may resonate with you as well. Again, as a student of history, and I like to believe that I'm not necessarily well-traveled, but I travel some, and I know that you are a person who speaks many languages, which I'm envious, because I believe that understanding cultures and people requires also understanding languages. I'm very limited. I only speak two. But I spent some time in Germany, and recently, about a year and a half ago, I went to Germany with a group of prosecutors. I'm fascinated by the way that the German legal system has evolved from, obviously a horrendous period of time in Germany, and the evolution of that, and actually the continued evolution of that. And I spent some time in Berlin, and we spent some time actually at the place, if you will, where the final solution was developed.
Yeah, the Wannsee.
And yes, and I know you know the place. And then really looking at how legalistically the Nazi regime, took advantage of a very sophisticated culture, very sophisticated nation, and started to create a legal scheme to justify what was about to happen. And the way the words were used, and quite frankly, extremely disturbing. Even the precision, how we use lawyers and accountants and engineers to actually create the entire machine that was developed to eventually, murder 6 million people and, throw the world into a war. And I tell people, and I said that to our German colleagues, as human beings, we are capable of redoing this anytime, anywhere. And I brought some correlation to the war on drugs and what happens in the United States. And at first, I think some of the Germans in the conversation were a little surprised that I was so not only open about it, but to say, look, I mean, I'm not here to pass judgment or single you out, because I think what happened here can happen, and it has happened, and it continues to happen. And certainly the U.S. in its own way has had its own genocides and continues to enforce a lot of that. So, I say all this to say that as I have grown into this line of work and certainly becoming a district attorney, and continue my own evolution of my own journey, I am very aware of how the legal system can be used for good, or very easily can be distorted and be used to destroy other human beings. And my fear is that in our system of law, we often, on the name of safety and on the name of community well-being, which has been purely that well-being, that safety, that public safety has been only defined by one group of people, not by an entire community, has been used to destroy other parts of our community. So when I do my work, and, certainly I did it as a district attorney in my own continuing evolution, by the way, I tell people that I evolve every single day, and I think is an important quality for human beings. I am very, very aware, increasingly so, of the role that I and my profession can play for either good or evil.
Yeah, and realizing just to what extent human beings can be so quickly turned into evil human beings, that probably
Yes.
that moment in Wannsee, I imagine, made you realize that. To what extent do you think, George, to what extent are you worried by the increasing militarization of the police forces in Los Angeles and really throughout the country?
I'm horrified.
I'm
horrified, and I'll tell you why. And again, having come from that system, and then looking at the recent images, when we had peaceful demonstrators, sometimes just simply sitting, praying, singing, holding hands, and seeing police use a level of force and the weaponry that was being used with very military precision. And by the way, I'm not sure if you know this, but I was also in the Army, right? So
yes, of course.
It's not, so I am very proud of my military service, right? But understanding that there's a time and a place, and the roles of the military in a democracy are very different. Well, the roles of the military, period, but certainly in a democratic country, should never be confused with the roles of the police. And unfortunately, the militarization of our police, the provision of weaponry that in many cases should only be used in the theater of war, but then even taking the design of weaponry that generally is associated with what a weapon of destruction in war would look like, and then sort of shifting the engineering to make it look, to make him apply what is called less lethal force, but yet intrinsically the design of the weapon, how it's operating, all that stuff being really very similar, and then using that on peaceful demonstrators, which is what I saw happen in my own city recently. It was very horrifying to me.
You expressed some reservation to the term war on drugs. How does a statement like defund the police resonate with you?
I take a very nuanced approach to that term, as I do with almost everything else. I think it's important to be nuanced. I have for years worked really hard to reduce footprint criminal justice system. I was one of the co-authors of a state initiative. It became known as Proposition 47 here. It was a voter initiative that basically said we are going to reduce the consequences, the criminal consequences for possession of drugs, for personal use, and for low-level offenses. And instead of calling them a high-level crime or a felony, we're going to categorize him as a misdemeanor or low-level crime, which is going to reduce the number of people in our state prison system. And then we're going to take that money away from the prison system, and we're going to put it into public health and education to the tune of around $500 million every year since the passage of this voter initiative in 2014. I believe that the continuation of that process, where we continue to identify things that we have applied the criminal justice system as the tool, as the answer, and that we should medicalize it, or we should create social answers to those problems. That money should be taken away from the criminal justice system, from prosecutors, from police, from prisons and jails. And that money needs to go to public health, education, and other verticals that will provide much better outcomes for all of us at the end. Criminalizing poverty, criminalizing mental health, criminalizing substance abuse have not gotten us to a good place. And part of the process to begin to go to a better place is taking money away from the systems that have criminalized this behavior that should be completely divorced from the criminal justice system, and start taking those resources and that money and start putting it in those places that they should have gone in the first place. I often tell people that approximately 40 years ago, we were at a fork, as there were many other parts of the world, when, we started facing some severe consequences of violence as a result of sort of the emergence and the growth of, drugs that were being given our soul in our communities and poisoning many of our communities, like crack and other drugs. And we, as a nation, could have taken that fork in one direction, which would have been one of addressing this through a public health, public education, social intervention look, as other nations did, by the way. I often talk about the Portuguese model, which later on I think it influenced a lot, many parts of Western Europe, but basically the Portuguese, about over 2 decades ago, decided to medicalize drug use. They decriminalized it, and they took a very different approach, and their outcomes have been much better than us. We, on the other hand, took a different fork. We took the fork of, we're going to run this through our criminal justice system. We're going to increase penalties. We're going to, grow the size of our police departments. We're going to grow the resources that we give them. We're going to militarize them. We're going to create more prisons, to the point in the state of California, we built 22 prisons during a period of time, and we built one public university. And we are here now. And the question for me in the defunding conversation is, how do we unwind all that harm by starting to take money away from the system that took us into this mistaken path, if you will, and start taking it to another direction? And understanding, certainly from my point of view, I believe that in a civilized society, there will always be a need for a professional police, and there will always be a need for prosecutors and jails and prisons. The question is one of scope,
right,
and size,
and what are police called in to do?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
Are they called in? Are they called in to be social workers? Do they have the experience for that? Is that what we need them for?
Exactly.
In a way, I spoke with another one of my guests, Suketu Mehta, who said, rather than defund the police, let's refund them.
Well, and see, I'm not so sure that I would agree, and I'm going to tell you why. I have come to the conclusion that the money really needs to go to other places. I don't believe that we should attempt to make, clinical psychologists out of police or social workers. I actually believe that what we need to do is we need to make sure that we create off-ramps for people to get away from the criminal justice system. And any time the police touches someone or a prosecutor, it really doesn't matter how we are under the umbrella of a criminal justice system. And those interventions might be different. And in many cases, I would hope that eventually we reimagine some different interventions where police is part of the intervention. But I think overall, we need to really kind of stop and think about, should we even have a police officer respond to a call involving somebody that is going through a psychotic episode?
Right.
Or should we have someone that actually was trained to deal with people like that, going through that moment, and actually be able to get there and have a different level of intervention? Because the reality is that we often ask our police to do things that are almost humanly impossible, in the sense that we ask them to be police officers, we ask them to be teachers, we ask them to be counselors, we ask them to be psychologists. And then, we go and hire somebody with a high school diploma and expect all of that too. And it's unrealistic, and I don't know that in the long run it's a good return on the public resources investment. I think we're better off just simply saying, look, there are times when, there are things that are going to require a badge and a gun and the authority of that level of intervention. But the reality is that those are really very limited, and that most of the human conflict and the things that deal with social tension in our communities often can be resolved by people that have different training, sometimes by people from the community themselves. But we have to feed that, and we have to, provide the resources for that to flourish. So I'd like to have, quite frankly, a very different conversation where we actually see a shrinkage of the criminal justice system. I tell people sometimes that if we were a bunch of Martians and we're dropping ourselves into a desert and we're creating a new society, with any point of reference to what we currently do, would our social structure be the same? Would we, the social control mechanisms, would they look the same? And I suspect that they wouldn't.
Right.
Because especially if we had a very sophisticated group of Martians, but without this point of reference, I think that they would be probably saying, well, if we have a problem that is driven by mental health, shouldn't we turn to the people that train to do that? And if we have a problem that is because of, social conflicts and the, human interactions, should we be turning to people that are training in dealing with social conflict and interaction? And then, when we have a problem, when we have armed people running around with guns trying to kill us, then should we turn to people that have that have the guns and the training to deal with that, right?
I think that what Suketu Mehta meant when he said refund, he meant differently fund. So differently fund in the sense that, just as you said with your example of the desert, we should bring the police when it is a question of policing, but not for everything. What I wanted also to ask you, George, as DA, what steps would you take to make sure that corporate crimes, and especially environmental crimes, are in fact prosecuted?
Yeah, Paul, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because, part of my work as a former DA in San Francisco was taking a very active role in looking at corporate polluters. And in San Francisco, frankly, because of the scope and, the size and the way, really have very little of that. We had to go aggressively search for it. I mean, it was there, and we found some. But LA County, on the other hand, is a hotbed of environmental injustice. You can go anywhere from unattended on oil wells that have not been properly capped, that are continuously poisoning our air, and the residents of those communities nearby, which are often poor people of color, that, for now generations are showing the signs of harm, cancer, unexplained higher rates of certain types of cancer, unexplained higher rates of respiratory ailments, unlawful dumping of industrial waste. I can go on and on. Our county is a hotbed for so much of that. And the leading prosecutor plays a role in that, because there are actually both tools to prosecute, environmental pollution often, and there are even consumer legislation that would probably create some creative tools for the district attorney to address that. And I find that is a very, very important component of the work. And I'm so glad that you bring it up, because a lot of people don't think about that, right? Most people think about, police abuse or police misconduct, and then they think about incarceration, and they think about, some of the other things that are very obvious and clearly very damaging. But there's so many other things, and environmental justice is one that I believe is tremendously important, because the impact of that over generations is so significant, and in our public health system, and the prosecutor plays a role. And certainly if I were to be elected, it's an area that I want to take a very activist role in.
George, in closing, so many more questions, I'm afraid, but time is running out, and I do want to ask you this question in closing. Is it possible, do you think, to use this moment to change the law to protect vulnerable tenants so they are less at the mercy of finding the right progressive officials in the DA office and elsewhere?
Paul, I think there is. I think that we have reached a moment in our history where the social and economic inequalities, especially on the more affluent regions, like the coastal parts of our country and our state, we have seen the instability, the social instability that has come from that increasing inequality of income that has led to unprecedented levels of houselessness. You probably have to go back to the Great Depression to find those periods. And in that period of time, we as a nation came together. We had great leadership then and created, many social changes that back then some people actually view them as socialist, and today people would never dream of getting rid of, like, Medicare and Social Security. I think we're at a point now that we're again in one of those inflection moments and understanding that government plays a role to ensure that people are not they're not removed from housing through the application or the unlawful application of property rights. I think is very, very important. And again, it's striking that balance, and we want to make sure that we protect people that work hard and build, some level of affluence and own rental property, because that's an important social component. But we also have to make sure that as a society we have answers to reduce the likelihood that people are thrown into the streets. And that burden, by the way, has to be shared by all of us. I will never advocate that, a property owner should now become the social worker that is going to house people, without any clear economic compensation for that. But understanding that there are social and legal obligations also, that those property owners need to be part of the solution. And then we collectively make sure that we create a path to ensure that people, that housing, much like public health and education, become a human right and not something that is only, granted to some and taken away from others.
George Gascón, it's been a true pleasure to talk to you. I wish you all the good luck and stay safe, and I hope your mother's health improves, and I look forward to when we can meet in person after this moment too passes. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure. All the best.
Likewise.
To you. Bye-bye.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.